There's some food in the back, so go ahead and help yourselves. We're also going to take a break in between the panels, so you'll be able to get some more refreshments and drinks. I'll introduce Mary Chestnut, who is our CEO, and she's moderating our first panel.
I want to thank Maryland nonprofits for the space, and also the ABLE Foundation for providing financial support for this event, and the National Association of Social Workers, and Jude Lombardi, who is our volunteer videographer. And I really want to thank Rachel, who has done an awful lot of work and an awful lot of organizing and collaborating and coalitioning and all of the above to bring this together. The YWCA's mission is to eliminate racism, empower women, and promote peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. Human trafficking is the antithesis of every element and aspect of that mission. So the YWCA is honored to work in partnership with organizations and individuals to increase our community's capacity to expose and end human trafficking, while also supporting and empowering those who struggle against it, those who are experiencing it. Our first 5 panelists represent 4 of those organizations.
So my name is Billie Shabazz. I'm a current student at Morgan State University, doing my master's in social work. I also work at the Polaris Project in Washington, D.C. I work with the National Human Trafficking Resource Center.
My name is Michelle Ekanemesang, and I also work with Billie at the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. And how I started in working in anti-trafficking work. I'm from the south side of Chicago, and I grew up in a community where a lot of my peers were actually trafficking victims well before it was called sex trafficking. I'm also a person who comes from a background that spans from Africa, South America, Asia, and the United States.
My name is Sabrina Balgamwalla. I'm an immigration attorney and also the clinical teaching fellow at the University of Baltimore School of Law Immigrant Rights Clinic. So I've represented a lot of immigrants with who've been survivors of trafficking and other forms of violence. Prior to coming to UB, I worked at the Asian Pacific American Legal Resource Center and did a lot of work with the Asian American community.
I'm Jessica Emerson. I'm a staff attorney and Equal Justice Works Fellow at the Women's Law Center of Maryland. In September, I started a project called the Trafficking Victims Post-Conviction Advocacy Project. And it's focused on anti-criminalization measures as they relate to survivors of human trafficking. I am a recent graduate of the University of Baltimore School of Law, that's why I gave a little. And before I was a lawyer, my previous career was as a social worker in New York City, which is kind of the route I got involved with working with survivors, but on the counseling and direct service end.
I'm Jacqueline Robarge, and I'm the Director of Power Inside, and we're a harm reduction and human rights program here in Baltimore. And we work with survivors of sexual assault, domestic violence, and sexual exploitation. Currently, we're the longest running program working with sexual assault, sexual exploitation survivors here in Baltimore. And I have been doing this work for 21 years. I started out in the domestic violence movement and started trying to focus on the survivors who are getting cut out of the women's movement because of race, class, or sexual orientation.
So let me just start with something that many in the room may be fairly familiar with, but also many may not. What is human trafficking? What's the extent of the problem in Maryland, and what kind of cases are we seeing for the most part in Maryland?
There are pretty much two forms of human trafficking, and so the first is labor trafficking, and so that's where someone is forced, coerced, or defrauded into working when they don't want to. And that is for, the elements of force, fraud, and coercion have to be present in the situation for both adults and children. And the other is sex trafficking, where someone is forced to engage in commercial sex or to have sex for something of commercial value, so it's not always for money. And so those situations, there has to be elements of force, fraud, or coercion for someone who is over 18, but those elements don't have to be present for someone who is considered a minor.
And they can also overlap.
Right, they can definitely overlap.
Right.
And one example of where they might overlap is where you see a person who's stripping. So where we work at the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, we may hear of someone who's stripping. that, if you're an adult, would be considered labor trafficking if you're doing it against your will. Because stripping in a lot of places is legal. But, you know, a lot of times that person is working for a pimp who's making that person also engage in what we call commercial sex, or what's known as prostitution. And so that person would fall in both areas. Another place you might see it is you'll have, say, a worker who may be working in a farm or someplace like that, or a domestic service worker, and that person is being trafficked by their employer to have sex, maybe, for example, to have sex with other workers to keep the male workers on the plantation or something and keep them happy. So they do overlap, like you said.
Mm-hmm. Recognizing that there's not a very strict line sometimes between cases, but what would you say is the percentage of cases that are strictly sex trafficking, for instance, and those that are labor trafficking?
In Maryland, by far right now what we're seeing is the predominance is for sex trafficking.
Okay.
But in a way that's skewed, because it's often easier for people to identify sex trafficking. You know, it's already happening in an area that is already considered illegal, so people are going to look at someone, you know, with curiosity if you're already engaging in prostitution. But labor trafficking worldwide is known to be far more prevalent in the world. It's just that it's very hidden, and so people don't actually see it. I would bet that most of us here come across, probably on a daily basis, labor trafficking victims and don't even know that we're encountering them.
Along those lines, I would say that labor trafficking is less visible also because there's sort of this gray area between smuggling and trafficking, which are distinct. So there's all these different, looking at it from an immigration perspective, there's all these push factors that are pushing people out of their countries of origin. So if the economic situation is bad, if people are in strained family situations, if there's a conflict, a local or national conflict, those are factors that may push people to go with a recruiter overseas. And at the time, there might not be forced fraud or coercion, right? The person might think, oh, I'm just going to go and I'm going to get this really lucrative job at a restaurant. But once they're in the United States, it turns out it is a trafficking situation, but it looks like the influx of labor and smuggling at the onset.
The public eye tends to be more on sex trafficking because of, in a lot of cases, is very sensationalized nature to the coverage. As a country, we have very conflicted feelings about sex and sexuality as a whole. And I think that a lot of times some of the public interest in sex trafficking is greater because we kind of just want to see what's going on in somebody's sordid, some kind of sordid sexual issue. And when we focus only on forced prostitution, we ignore labor trafficking, which for all accounts is probably more prevalent. But the sensationalized nature of sex and sexuality in our country, I think, impacts people's focus on sex trafficking over labor trafficking.
I would add what trafficking is not. Sex trafficking is not sex work, where people are voluntarily engaged in phone sex, stripping, dominatrix work, other kinds of sex work that may not even involve sexual contact for money. Trafficking is also not survival sex, which is an incredibly exploitive form of sex trade, but it may or may not involve elements of force, fraud, or coercion. There's a very distinct differences. Sometimes they bleed into one another, but you can recognize it when you see it. And the other thing to think about in terms of labor trafficking and just labor in general is sexual harassment, sexual exploitation happens in the context of labor wherever it is. And so labor trafficking with women oftentimes involves some sexual harassment or even sexual exploitation in the context of labor, as it does for many women in the workforce.
Are there particular populations of women, men, girls, boys, transgender individuals who are particularly vulnerable to trafficking? Within those populations, are there racial disparities?
That's a lot.
Yeah.
Let's try to unpack
That's a
it.
big question.
A lot of times when we see trafficking victims come forward, and I'm using victims, but some people identify as survivors. When you see someone who's experienced trafficking coming forward, if they're sex trafficking victims, you often see females. If they're labor trafficking victims, that's where you see a lot of males. Now, that being said, in sex trafficking, within that, LGBTQ individuals are very vulnerable to human trafficking. It's just very difficult, particularly when you're talking for providing services, for them to access services because of the way our system is set up. So an LGBTQ individual who's coming forward and saying, I'm a victim of sex trafficking, has a hard time finding shelter. And so a lot of times they're trapped even still in their situation because a lot of times they're, say it's a transgendered person, their medication, their hormones are linked to pleasing the mom, house mom, or someone who's involved. And once they remove from that situation, they lose their meds. So, you know, they may come forward at first on our hotline and call, but we don't have anywhere to send them. And so a lot of times then they choose to stay. In terms of racially speaking, it's hard in some instances because there's just really not good tracking for trafficking to begin with. Instead of being treated as a victim, a lot of victims are actually treated as criminals. And then even when we do identify them, we tend to identify trafficking victims by national origin and not by race or ethnicity. As a result, what you hear more of is what's happening by national origin. What you're not hearing about is what's happening to US citizens and where in the United States you are actually seeing disparities. So where you get it is usually through anecdotal evidence, and I myself, through my own research and being interested in this, have had to pull from other places. So one of the things I had to do was go to the FBI Crime in the US report, and look from 2000 to 2012 at people who were reported as being arrested for prostitution under the age of 18. Now that's kind of hard because when you're doing something like that, they could be someone who doesn't have a pimp or controller. It could be someone who's a child engaging in survival sex. But what we do know is that's a person who's being sexually exploited. And when you look at those numbers, given that in the United States, 13% of us in the United States are African American or Black, the arrest records consistently show that African American youths under the age of 18 are arrested at about 40 to 60%. So that means that of all of the people who are being arrested, 40 to 60% of them are Black. The other thing that we have is the Bureau of Justice Statistics has looked at very small windows of arrests and rescue, if you want to say, of victims. And in 2007 to 2008, they showed that sex trafficking victims in particular, they had a lot more Latino victims. And labor trafficking, by and large, were Latino victims. But when you came to 2008 to 2010, the Bureau of Justice Statistics showed that you had a lot more African American sex trafficking victims and still a lot, by far, Latino victims of labor trafficking. So those are the places where I've been able to tease out some disparities and find information. The other thing I will say is I go a lot and borrow from sexual assault and domestic violence and ask, what am I seeing in these communities? Because those people sometimes, you have intersections and they're masked. And so if I'm seeing, again, disparities across like sexual orientation or race or even language differences, I look there. And I do see those disparities. One last thing I do want to say is that also Native American Indians, or American Indians, Native Americans, they also show that a good percentage of their female youths in particular are victims to sex trafficking. And they oftentimes have a lot of resources that they're pulling together in places like Minnesota because it's just so prevalent.
What's the relationship then between trafficking and immigration? And to what extent are our laws making the situation even more difficult.
How many folks in the room are familiar with the T visa? How about the U visa? They both come from the same law, which is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which Congress passed in 2000. The act produced or gave rise to the Trafficking in Persons report, where the U.S. ranks countries according to their measures they take to prevent and protect individuals who've been trafficked. And the T visa and the U visa came as a result of the U.S.'s desire to improve their rank, to show that they were taking meaningful action on behalf of trafficking survivors. So the T visa is specifically a form of relief that's for a trafficking survivor. You're eligible for that if you are in the U.S. as the result of having been trafficked here. You comply with reasonable requests from law enforcement to assist in the investigation or prosecution of the trafficking. The survivor must demonstrate that they would suffer if they were returned back to their home country. So that could be they have medical needs that have developed as a result of being trafficked. There might be fear from traffickers against being re-trafficked themselves, or retaliation against family members, or stigmatization. For folks in Latin America, we've been making a lot of arguments that the maras, the gangs, target people who've been in the United States because there's an assumption that they have money, so they've been extorted and otherwise targeted. That would be an example of an extraordinary reason why they wouldn't be able to go back. So there was the note that the requirement of assistance to law enforcement can be waived if the survivor is under 18, or if there's psychological reasons why they can't comply, though Jess and I were just talking about how difficult that exception is to actually get. This law enforcement cooperation requirement is the bane of existence for a lot of folks. And this is because, well, recently we started working with somebody who can't prove that she was in her trafficking situation on the day the law went into effect. There are people who might not have been willing to come forward with law enforcement for fear of being re-trafficked, or because the person who trafficked them said, don't give any information, I will get a lawyer, I will get you out, or there might be consequences. So there's a lot of reasons why people don't come forward. It puts a lot of discretion in the hands of law enforcement agents. I think there's offices that do it well, there's offices that really struggle with it, but the risk, of course, is that if somebody says, well, I don't really want to come forward, law enforcement says you're not a cooperative victim, you are an accomplice, and you get put in removal proceedings, and you've committed a crime against moral turpitude, there's no way you're coming back to the United States. So it's sort of, it's a great remedy that we have available, but it's not without its problems, I would say. The other remedy is the U visa, and this is more broad. It's for individuals who are survivors of various types of crime, mostly violent crime. Trafficking is one of them. And that person has to possess helpful information about the criminal activity and be willing to cooperate with law enforcement regarding the prosecution. The criminal activity has to violate the laws of the U.S. Both remedies, I should have said, allow people to petition for family members to work and to get a path to a green card and citizenship, so it's a really attractive remedy. But again, in the U visa, the law enforcement certification for U visas is absolutely essential. You cannot apply for a U visa without law enforcement assistance. We can talk about this maybe a little bit more. I love to have conversations about this, but my overall critique, although this is a big step forward for protecting immigrant survivors, I have concerns about what it means to put people in a victim box, because especially we've done work with men who've been survivors of labor trafficking, and it's very emasculating for them to have to present themselves as victims in this way, as opposed to people who stood up to their employers. There's this contrary narrative. And I think it's also problematic when we take into account survivor agency. Right? So what does coercion look like? And if it doesn't look a certain way, if people say, I think it's better, I'm making a choice today that I'm not going to run away because I want to protect myself in the long term, because I want to protect my family. This requirement of reporting to law enforcement doesn't really respect where the person is in that moment, and might not have them be doing the thing that's safest for them in that moment. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that victim box at some point.
The requirement of cooperating with law enforcement, it may be codified in some of the federal statutes, but it exists just as heavily When you're talking about relief like vacator, which is basically setting aside a prostitution conviction, or an affirmative defense to prostitution. Basically, the United States, there are various approaches that countries have taken and can take to address human trafficking. The United States is focused primarily on a criminal justice approach. And basically what that means is it values the prosecution of traffickers, and that tends to be kind of the primary goal of human trafficking work in the country, is to prosecute traffickers. That's a great goal. I don't have a problem with that goal per se, but how it tends to occur in practice is that the prosecution of traffickers is valued over the rights of trafficking victims, okay? And it results in very high rates of arrest of trafficking victims, and the use of these victims as a tool to effectuate the prosecution of these traffickers. I mean, I hear these stories all the time. We'll arrest them, we'll talk to them, we know they're a victim, but we're still gonna dangle this conviction over their heads as a way to get them to cooperate with law enforcement. Criminalization has a whole host, and I'm sure Jackie can speak to this. We've actually had about an hour-long conversation that kind of basically spanned what I'm saying. Criminalization has an incredibly large amount of collateral harms. There are concrete harms in terms of not being able to obtain housing, having limits on public housing, having limits on availability of health insurance. And then there's the stigma. If we're talking about sex trafficking in particular, the stigma of having a prostitution conviction on your record cannot be underestimated. And so when you're talking about the harms of criminalization, we really have to recognize how the one kind of larger overarching US goal directly negatively impacts the other goal, which is to support victims.
So, yes, all of this.
All the things.
All of the things. If we back up and look at how this all began, from the feds about 10, 15 years ago, trying to get international trafficking victims. They had difficulty finding them here in the US. And so what they did is, instead of looking harder, they expanded the definition of who was a trafficked person to include domestic trafficking across state lines and such. Then they also included child sex trafficking, moving children back and forth for prostitution. And they're expanding it even into places such as familial trafficking and things like that, where normally it used to be called child sexual abuse or reckless endangerment or those types of things. So we keep expanding the definitions of trafficking out and beyond, and to the degree that we've now kind of started to actually arrest victims and accept that as a way to help them. As if that is the only way that they will get help. So for example, there was a huge federal sting, I guess in July. They do it every year and they publicize it widely. They go out and they send tons of police officers all over the country to rescue people. Well, in Baltimore City, they arrested 3 pimps. This was a federal operation. Marshals and police and everybody doing overtime and racking up tons of city dollars to do this trafficking sting, and they arrested 3 pimps. How many people did they rescue? 0. So where are the victims? So, and then when you look at the roll call of what happened during that federal sting, Tennessee arrested a whole bunch of people and no pimps. And then this other place, arrested 5 pimps and rescued no people. And then the rescues actually, there is no way to know if a rescue also involves an arrest. And I feel like
usually does.
That's where we need to go with this, is that some of the collateral consequences happen on the very, very front end. Contact with the police is very, very traumatizing, especially for a young person. And when I talk to some folks here in Maryland, why do we actually arrest juvenile girls, or boys for that matter, for prostitution? Someone said that is the only way we can find them and get them services. That is the only way. Deneen knows, and I know, that you give me the same dollars to arrest, charge, pay for the public defender, the judge, the detention, all of those things. Give me that money and I will get you plenty of survivors who voluntarily come in for help.
And if you stopped arresting them.
And if you stopped arresting them.
The girls at Waxter's will come forward, but the boys at Hickey will not come forward because just last month they arrested 3 boys for prostitution. And so, you know, the boys are telling me,
Right.
I can talk to you, but you know, if I feel like if anyone finds out, then I'm going to be targeted for, even if I get out of here, what's going to happen to me?
So there was a case recently where a battered woman, the judge ordered her not to see her batterer. Where we really believe that our social problems, our cultural problems, must be solved through the criminal justice system. And it is flatly not true. It's where the battered women's movement has gotten off track in the last 30 years. And, you know, when we look at racial disparities, that is where it's leading us, because the criminal justice system is inherently racist. And will disproportionately target Black people, if we're talking about Maryland, or people of color if we're looking at nationally by and large. And so if we're looking at enforcement of any particular crime in Maryland, we are going to be arresting Black people. But what happens as we try and find these perpetrators is we upcharge them. Now, a prosecutor will say they flatly do not do that, but I've been to court hundreds of times for the last 13 years in Maryland, and it is very curious how something starts out one thing and gets dropped down to something else.
Can you explain upcharge?
I'm sorry. So, for example, a young person that we met in the Baltimore City Detention Center, she is 19 years old. She's involved in prostitution. She's a homeless runaway, and she's prostituting with a 17-year-old. She buys a motel room for her on North Avenue, y'all know where it is, buys a motel room for her and her 17-year-old to prostitute out of. And they arrest and rescue the 17-year-old, and they charge the 19-year-old with human trafficking. She rented a motel room, and honestly, you talk to this girl, she's incredibly confused. She believes she's there on a prostitution charge, but the penalties for that are really, really amazing. And then if you look at what happens when people have contact with the police, even if with all the best intentions the police are trying to rescue someone, let's say they have marijuana on them, or they have broken into an abandoned house to sleep. There are other crimes that they will be charged in, and so we actually only charge about 1,200 people in Maryland for prostitution, or in Baltimore City for prostitution, not very many. But what else are they being charged with? So when we go to the Baltimore City Detention Center, more than a third of the women in a Hopkins study that we commissioned said that the women had traded sex for something. So it's an incredibly common survival behavior, because when you have nothing, at least you have that. And once you know how to do it, you always can go back to doing it. It's a survival mechanism, but it comes with great penalty. And as people kind of come into the field and confuse what is happening, the consequences can be very, very great, because once someone is identified to the federal authorities, the penalties, we know a 19-year-old was charged originally with 15 years to life, and she called 911 for help. And so, you know, we can't always control what happens, but, you know, we have to remember that all of this trafficking does not happen in a vacuum. It happens in the context of the American criminal justice system, and we have to kind of connect it back out to these other pieces.
I think we also have to be vigilant, and I hear it among the panelists in how we talk about this, because when you conflate prostitution with trafficking, when you're not familiar with what trafficking is not, like Jackie was describing, you'll get situations where very well-meaning people will support legislation, for instance, that will have a lot of unintended consequences. A 19-year-old who goes, or 2 friends that are involved in sex work, and they watch out for each other. I know where you are when you're out on the date, I know, and you know where I am. Under Maryland law, we could be charged with human trafficking. And it's very important to kind of look, and we'll talk, I know legislation is one of the other topics, and I have some stuff to say about that too, but.
Michelle and Billie?
One thing I just wanted to mention is I think that a lot of times when we talk about immigration in terms of human trafficking, we are aware that people who were not born in the United States may have a fear of of police and things like that, and may be less likely to report crimes that they are victims of or anything that they experience. And I think that a lot of those things are true for people who are born in the United States as well. And I think that it's really important for us to recognize that, because, you know, the fear of retaliation and the stigma and fear of law enforcement are things that, you know, I would fear, you know what I mean? And as much as you know, talk to people over the phone and you talk to people in person about maybe protective orders in terms of domestic violence and stuff like that, you always have the understanding that law enforcement is not something that you can always depend on, you know what I mean? And so I think that one part, I hope I'm not jumping ahead, but I think that one thing that's really important is that, you know, we all have our jobs in this room, but we're also connected to some other institution. And so I think it's really important for us to begin to challenge our churches and challenge our, you know, religious institutions and things like that, to start to bring to light to our congregations and our general community members what human trafficking is and how we can support victims. Because oftentimes people won't go to law enforcement, but they might go to church, or they might go to a teacher or something like that. And it's really important for us all to be aware of human trafficking and how to respond when those things happen.
When there are organizations in New York that are getting 90% of their referrals not from law enforcement, we're missing something. And when you think about that, a very large percentage of the violence and discrimination and stigma that people involved in sex work, no matter their method of entry into sex work, is by law enforcement. And then using a criminal justice perspective, we're mandating cooperation with law enforcement. We all got to scratch our heads when we're thinking about these things, because the two things, they don't work.
And I think, echoing also what's being said here, is there's one other part of the criminal justice system that actually a lot of times is locked out of the conversation entirely. And that, so there's one part of the criminal justice system that oftentimes is locked out of the conversation entirely, and that part of it are the defense bar, I should say, is the defense bar. So defense lawyers are actually encountering victims on a regular basis. When I was working with the public defender's office, and also in New York where I was doing work up there, you know, what we were seeing were actually people who could easily be victims of human trafficking or experiencing some other form of vulnerability that lent itself to human trafficking, but defense lawyers are not part of this paradigm. So no one is inviting them in, and when I was on the defense bar, I was closed out. So it took me leaving the defense bar and coming into the nonprofit world and bringing that knowledge that I have from other areas to then reach the victims. You know, so I just want to say that even in the criminal justice system itself, there are ways that we can address this problem, but it's also with our prosecution lens that we have, we've closed the door to all of these different places.
When someone calls the hotline, and we'll make the hotline number is on materials, and everybody should be sure to have that number. When someone calls, what I would assume you don't say, okay, go to the police. How do you advise?
When a person calls the hotline, we don't just immediately jump to law enforcement. And the reason is because if we do that, they're going to hang up the phone.
Oftentimes we kind of have to ask whether or not we can relay their contact information to law enforcement. And at that point, there's almost like a complete shutdown with the person who's on the phone. But that's also really important for law enforcement if they want to contact that person directly, or if they have additional information or something like that.
So you're sort of stuck as well as an advocate.
We can be, depending on how the caller would respond.
We try to strike a balance between understanding a person's situation and not having them sitting there re-traumatizing themselves. Because just discussing it is just it's just amazingly difficult for a person. And then once they've hung up the phone, they're left there with all those feelings. So what we try to do is we try to strike this balance of hearing their story, getting enough so that we can see that there's force, fraud, coercion, that it's labor trafficking or it's sex trafficking. And once we get there, we then say, in most instances, what would you like us to do? So, like, what are you seeking from us today? Are you seeking a referral to a service provider? Then we have established relationships with, a network of service providers, and we try to plug you there or guide you there. Are you seeking a legal service provider? We know a lot of lawyers who will help you vacate charges or do other things, and we try to plug you in there. And there are people who are like, no, I want to report him. I mean, like, we do get some really angry people who are like, no, I want you to go find him today, go get him, he did this. And what we do in that case is we can either file an anonymous report, or we can, if that's what they want, or we can file a report that has their contact information. It's more powerful if there's contact information, because that means police can ask you the question. And they're more likely to follow up. Now, we don't just send it to 911. We actually have regional specialists who have a relationship with law enforcement. So, and some of them will even go so far as to have us, we're able to call them in the middle of the night. If we find out that there's someone who's being trafficked somewhere in Baltimore, we do have a contact. It doesn't mean that, based on the parameters they've given us, we might not be able that day to call them at 12 o'clock at night. But as Billie and I know, we get that report to law enforcement before their eyes, and they actually see it. And they do follow up. They call back, and they ask us questions, and we talk to them on a regular basis. So we're not just sending it to some nameless law enforcement, we're actually sending it to, say, Keith Bickford in Oregon, who is with the Oregonians Against Trafficking Humans, who, if you've seen any anti-trafficking videos featuring law enforcement, you'll see him. So we're actually sending it to a physical person who gets up and goes and looks at it.
There's apparently a clear connection, obviously, with poverty and race and ethnicity and immigration status. But there's also a link there with homelessness.
Mm-hmm. If you look at what tracks people into the criminal justice system, and you go one step back, not having shelter, and then what leads to not having shelter is really a pretty direct link. Mm-hmm. There's like these awful tracks that our women are on, and so one track is a young lesbian woman who gets someone harassed at school and kind of gets stereotyped as being tough and a thug, and she ends up, being bullied and drops out of school and can't get into a shelter, and it really isn't well received by people in her church, and ends up homeless. And she either prostitutes or deals drugs, and kind of has this whole kind of range of behaviors to survive. That are both criminal and survival, and also very, very traumatizing. So she already has the trauma that happened when she was young, but then also there's things that happen while people are living a street life, and she gets tracked into the system. And by the time she ends up in the system, she's the person that most people are afraid of. A tough kid who is, has a gender expression that most people don't understand, and really makes a lot of assumptions just based on how they present, not to mention she has a criminal background. But then there's also the trauma survivor, the sexual abuse survivor, who grows up learning that her body is an object for other people's use. And that kind of becomes a theme throughout, promiscuity, to kind of these exploitive situations that kind of seep into, hey, I could do this for money. And then you need drugs or alcohol to actually cope with that, and depending on what type of coping mechanism you use, legal or illegal, that tracks you into a different thing, and then you end up in an abandoned house, because when everything else happens, there's still abandoned houses in Baltimore where people stay, and that is illegal. So even just being homeless is illegal, and we have plenty of women who are trafficked and sexually exploited straight from their abuse history, into homelessness, and just their existence is criminalized because living in an abandoned house in Baltimore City is a criminal behavior. And so, we'll talk a little bit about some of the remedies for that collateral consequence. But, when we look at trafficking and prostitution and survival sex and whatever words we use for it, or sex work, it is always in a context of something else. And so a lot of times we think of the most desperate people because those are the people we're trying to help. The sex workers are doing okay. They don't need our help. They don't need a case manager. They don't want one. And so they can just do their thing. And we've had a couple call when they've gotten locked up in Maryland. They're like, oh my gosh, I didn't know I could be arrested for prostitution. I'm like, yes, you can. But they don't really need the same kind of help our people do. So we tend to talk about those people that are most desperate. But, again, our study in the city jail showed that women who had traded sex for anything, food, drugs, money, food, housing, to avoid arrest, were 4 times more likely to be homeless upon release. And that was just based on asking them, where are you going when you get out? And that was from a population who are already 1 in 4 have no idea where they're going at all. So if you multiply that times 4, this is like a tremendous amount of people who are being forced back into the one behavior that can get them a warm place to sleep at night. And so, trading sex and homelessness are intertwined. And when we try and separate it out in the homeless community, because that's kind of the folks I roll with, it's a false separation. And just like domestic violence is a false separation in homeless women, they are woven together when you're, and I only work with women right now, so I'm talking about women. So when I say these women are the same women, they're not any different than one woman or another. And so, when we talk about services in the second panel, we can talk about how to integrate those services so that we're not like assuming this is somebody else's client, or picking up the phone and panicking all of a sudden when you've done a good counseling session and someone reveals something to you, because they will, if you ask them, what do you want to do, sometimes it's, I just need a place to stay, I got to get out of this situation. And their way out of trafficking is shelter.
And I love what you said about their very existence being criminalized. Mm-hmm. Poverty is criminalized. You can't sleep in an abandoned building. You can't sleep in a doorway. You can't urinate in public. You have to urinate, and all of these things, when we criminalize not only prostitution or sex work, when we continue this process of criminalizing poverty, essentially, you narrow the field of opportunity down to very, very little. And we continue, we kind of advance on this theory of wanting to help people, and the word rescue, which I personally don't like, but without addressing this culture of criminalization, their lives just keep narrowing and keep getting more marginalized and more limited. And if we're not addressing criminalization as a larger issue, then we're not addressing the root of the problems. As Jackie said, whenever you meet anybody involved who has been trafficked, you're going to see a whole host of missed opportunities from various service providers, education, family, foster care, you name it. There were missed opportunities. And it's kind of why I think when you think about trafficking, you have to think about it as a larger issue. Like you hear a lot about end demand and things like that. It's a very one-note kind of approach to things, when there are a multitude of issues, as Jackie very wisely shared. There's a multitude of issues that have to be addressed, and criminalization is a huge piece of it.
I just want to swing the pendulum a little back to labor trafficking and poverty. That's like the foundation of it, right? You have people coming to the United States. A lot of them are coming in on guest worker visas, and when they get here, if you had any clue of what our businesses are doing to them. People who are here because we said that we couldn't find employees in the United States, and they're here. And I mean, like, the only way I can think of it is think back to sharecroppers, and after that, when you had people coming in from the Caribbean, and now you have people coming in from Latin America, South Africa, the Slavic area. I mean, like, people are coming into this country, and if you even began to understand what they're picking our food, and they're not given water to drink. So when they're so thirsty, some of them have no choice, but they're drinking the waste that the animals are leaving. They're working for a full day, and they're not allowed to use the bathroom or sit down or rest. They are driven from the field back to a farm like living area, and they are not allowed to leave. They don't see their money, or when they do see their money, they're not given what they were promised. A lot of wage theft happens. They're not trying to steal from us. They're not trying to do anything wrong. They're coming to the United States to make money so that they can feed their children and their spouses back where they are. So you've got that going on with people coming into the United States, and it's happening. Carnivals, you know, like the carnivals you see in the parking lots and stuff. I'm not going to say all of them, but a good number of them, you would never get on those carnival rides if you understood that it's someone who's come here who has been working 24 hours straight, and that's the person who put up that Ferris wheel, and they're not allowed to rest. And, you know, they have no way out. Some of them, when they try to get out, they get beat up. Their documents, imagine if you went to work and someone took your driver's license, your social security card, and your birth certificate. They don't see it till they leave. And then they're walking around and they're arrested as undocumented persons in some places and mistreated. And so they're so terrified, they just sit there and take it. They take it when their boss shoots off guns at their trailer. You know, that's not something we as people tolerate. We just don't know it happens because it's well hidden. You know?
And I would add to that, so it's kind of an interesting counterpoint, right? So there's criminalization, and the flip side of the coin is it's amazing what employers get away with.
Yeah.
And the conditions that you, like, nobody is cracking down on those. And what's interesting is, like, for example, the carnival workers, it's very hard to get U visa or T visa certification for them.
Yeah.
It's really hard to get certification relief for individuals in the labor context, because this force, fraud, and coercion has to be extensive. It can't just be bad work conditions. It has to be at another level.
We're talking, I mean, you literally have to say, okay, they've slit my wrist, I'm bleeding now. Come help.
Or they have to have taken a passport. They have to have. There was a really extreme situation where, this gives me chills. The guest workers who are working from India doing Katrina post-relief, so obviously it's very contentious, right? Because you know who the workforce was displaced. For that, so there are these people, they were being kept in terrible conditions. A group of them ran away. They were picked up by the sheriff. He says, I'm sorry, you belong to your employer. I have to take you back.
We have U.S. citizens that are labor trafficking victims. One that we see often and don't realize are those traveling sales crews. So people that you're seeing in the communities who are selling magazines or other type of traveling documents where they're knocking on your door, a lot of them are young males and females who are U.S. citizens who are taken in a van, 15-passenger van. Their IDs are taken away from them. Most of them don't even know what city or state they're in because they move so frequently that they don't even know where to begin. A lot of them are so poor that when they're beaten up and abandoned because they didn't meet their quota for the day and they never really got paid, at most they get like $5 or $10 a day to eat, you know, they're sitting there and there's no way for them to get home. And their family cannot even put together $25 to get them some food. And so they're calling us at 2 o'clock in the morning in the middle of somewhere in the United States going, or, you know, North Maryland going, how am I gonna get home? I have no place to stay. And guess what? I'm a male and I can't get shelter. You know, unless I go to a homeless shelter. And when I go to the homeless shelter, I get beat up again. Or, you know, something worse happens. So that's one place you're seeing it. Another thing that I want to call your attention to, because it happens here in Maryland quite a bit, are those kids who are selling and begging. A lot of times those kids are actually, there is an adult who is making those kids go out and beg. And the adult is making these kids actively work, and they say they're doing things like they have to, if they gain so much money, they're going to go on a trip, or it's for their youth program. But then when you really question them and you really push it and you ask for proof, or like, where's a permission slip from your parents or something like that, they can't answer your question. And we're seeing that here in Maryland, you know. And one other we're seeing in Maryland are members of the Rom, or we used to call them gypsies. You see begging happening, and you're not realizing that that woman with her little child, who might look like she's not so well dressed, or she could be clean but wearing shabbier clothes, is someone whose family told her to go out there and beg in order for her to live. So we're seeing this happen on sex trafficking, but we're also seeing it happening on labor trafficking, and in both cases, U.S. and foreign nationals.
Okay, so what to do about it? Is there current legislation?
I'll talk about one piece of legislation that I am most recently working on. Job Opportunities Task Force and a number of other advocates are working on legislation called criminal record shielding, and it's winding its way through Annapolis right now, and it will shield minor misdemeanor charges that are a very select list negotiated over many attempts to get this through the legislature, to shield someone's criminal background after 3 years, after they've completed all of their sentencing and everything, to employers, housing, and education. And the reason I wanted to bring it up here is over the years, when all the advocates were working on expungement and now shielding, every year I kind of say, put prostitution on the list, because and it always like, oh, all right, Jackie, we'll do that. And and it seems like it's a struggle both with advocates and with the legislature to keep that misdemeanor charge on a list. But I keep wondering, why is it so difficult to imagine people we now accept almost universally as at least somewhat exploited by the time you get charged, criminally for prostitution? Why do we want to reserve the right to see that they were charged with prostitution 3 years later? Why does Kentucky Fried Chicken or Taco Bell or McDonald's need to know someone has been charged with prostitution? We had someone recently who's got 8 prostitution charges. She's 50 years old. She testified in Annapolis and did beautifully. She was asked on a housing application. And I was like, why is that necessary? And the reason this is important is because, it is a particularly shameful charge to have because of the way our culture has stigmatized this very act. And so we have to ameliorate not just for the criminal record, but also the stigma that we put on women who have engaged in this behavior. It is just a behavior. And some victims, or many victims, get charged with this behavior also. So if you look at the people somewhat voluntarily involved in it, and the victims, and the people who choose it, and it's a misdemeanor crime for, there's a lot of reasons why it should be shielded. And I would go on to say that while the vacating conviction process is an important and laudable one, I believe it's overly onerous and inappropriate to go to the prosecutor and ask for forgiveness to put your case before a judge to vacate a prostitution conviction. So shielding would allow this universal kind of blanket approach to a very minor crime, along with a bunch of other minor crimes that, guess what? Victims of trafficking also accumulate, like disorderly conduct, and trespassing, and especially trespassing and things like that. And so that's one remedy, and I'm sure, I don't know how we're doing on time. I've got like
just to clarify about having to go to the prosecutor, Maryland's, I came into this after the law was passed, but it's just worth noting that of the 15 states that have these laws on the books, that basically you can set aside a prostitution conviction for a victim of sex trafficking, someone who committed the act under duress. Maryland's law actually requires, before you even get in front of a judge, before you even get to a hearing, you have to have the consent of the state's attorney.
Which I think is highly inappropriate.
I think it might be unconstitutional.
And again, we go back to this confusion of like, what are we doing here? If we're trying to prove this person's a victim, we go to the person who charged them as a criminal.
And again, that
conflict of interest.
people get involved in anti-trafficking work with very good hearts and very good intentions. But I think that when we consider legislative advocacy relating to human trafficking, we have to use a really critical eye to assure basically that we are not sacrificing one marginalized group for another. In the same way that I do not want people to conflate prostitution and sex trafficking, or sex work, or voluntary sex work and involuntary sex work, you also can't divorce them completely either because of the criminal justice approach, because of the hyper-policing of prostitution, because of the complex problems associated with victims disclosing their victimization. Legislative efforts that will harm sex workers generally, again, regardless of their method of entry into sex work, will harm trafficking victims. I can promise you this. And the way that the thing that I love saying is unintended consequences. There was a bill that was passed in the New York City Council a couple of years ago that was like a $5,000 to $10,000 fine on taxi drivers who knowingly transported a victim of sex trafficking. So it makes sense. You don't want a taxi driver who's working in cahoots with a pimp to keep, that I'm okay with that. But if you think even further than kind of the immediate need or the immediate problem that the law seeks to target, taxi drivers can't afford a $5,000 to $10,000 fine, so they're not going to pick up women perhaps in neighborhoods that they're uncomfortable in and they want to get out, or who are scantily dressed, or people who are profiled as sex workers, like trans people, especially trans women. And if we don't think about those unintended consequences, we can do a lot of harm legislatively.
They're working on, in Annapolis, sometimes raising penalties for crimes that have never even been prosecuted. So they passed one law in the anti-trafficking law enforcement-based approaches to trafficking, and it's a group of fines. And then the next year they'll come and try and increase the fines and put a lot of effort into perpetrator-focused bills. Perpetrator-focused bills. So, for example, there's a proposed every year. I don't know if it's coming around this year, but they were trying to raise the age of who is a victim. Kind of makes sense. Yeah, if you're 21, you're still probably youthful enough and probably more likely exploited, more vulnerable. But if you raise the age of who is a victim, you're raising the age, or you're encompassing more of who is a perpetrator. And when I'm working with homeless youth who work in very big social networks to survive, that means you could be ensnaring a whole group of people as perpetrators who are using survival skills, not exploiting one another. And once these laws are in the hands of law enforcement, no advocate with the most laudable goals can control for what the criminal justice system is intending to do in our communities.
Yeah.
So,
I think overall we can't take a human rights approach to trafficking and not take a human rights approach to other marginalized populations, particularly sex workers. If you're outraged by violence against trafficking survivors, if you're outraged over hyper-policing and criminalization of trafficking survivors, the treatment of sex workers as a whole would knock your socks off.
the last example I will give in terms of advocacy, when we first were offered some anti-human trafficking money 12 years ago, we were asked to sign a waiver that we did not sign and we did not get funded. The waiver said that we would not provide material assistance to support prostitution, basically. I was like, what does that mean? And they were like, well, like give resources to people prostituting and things like that. And so, you know, while I know it's splitting hairs, it is kind of troubling to think if I put people in my car all the time. And I give people food, I even give them condoms. Some of those people are, you know, they're lying to me about their age, you know, and that's, again, a survival thing. And, you know, if I could scoop everybody up off the street, I would, I promise you. I haven't been doing this for this long to want people being exploited or harmed. You know, my whole mission is the exact opposite of that. But I didn't like the implication of being seen as someone who facilitates human trafficking by trying to assist people in the moment that they're in. And we know this is true on an international level. There's a West African drop-in center that for many, many years, and internationally, they have a much better handle on integrating sex work and human trafficking, because it's the sex workers themselves who've been trying to stop the exploitation of one another. And so there was a drop-in center where they came in and they arrested every single woman in this African country drop-in center for facilitating prostitution under some brand new anti-human trafficking laws. And it got very little media attention except in some circles, but it really was defeating the purpose. And some of us have had to try and continually explain what we've tried to do over the years to actually help one another, help people out of jams. And it's just very disheartening sometimes to see that being manipulated into something very, very ugly that none of us really intend.
It's a punitive approach rather than a supportive approach. One more comment, and then we're going to close this panel, and then we'll be ready for the next panel.
In Maryland, if you're a male and you are a victim of human trafficking, it's very hard to find a place to put you. On our hotline, we scramble. We literally scramble when we have a male who needs a place to stay. Also, some counties, because Maryland focuses on a county-by-county basis, if we have a victim in Prince George's County who was then transported to Anne Arundel County, and we're trying to get that person in shelter in, say, Anne Arundel County or Howard County or anywhere else, we're told no. That person resides in Prince George's County, so they need to travel back to Prince George's County in order to get help. And a lot of times that victim actually fled from Prince George's County, from their trafficker, to Anne Arundel County where they thought they could be safer. So, you knowing about this and then saying, this is my county and we want to make sure that anyone coming through our county who needs help can get help irrespective of their gender, irrespective of where they're from, because they're here now and they're hurt, I think is something really important to push for.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Billie.